Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The desert wind cut across the Nevada landscape like a blade, whistling through the chain-link fences that surrounded Groom Lake. Private First Class Ryan Mitchell pulled his jacket tighter as he walked his patrol route through Delta Zone, the gravel crunching beneath his boots with each measured step. 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, and the world felt as empty as it always did out here. 2 years. 2 years of walking the same routes, checking the same sensors, watching the same endless stretch of nothing. Mitchell had requested active duty after his National Guard unit was deactivated, thinking he'd see some real action. Instead, he got assigned to guard what the higher-ups called experimental aircraft, and what everyone else whispered were weather balloons with too many classified stamps. The isolation got to everyone, eventually. Mitchell had seen good soldiers crack under the weight of all that emptiness, all those secrets they weren't allowed to know. Some requested transfers after a few months. Others developed drinking problems or started talking to themselves during long night shifts. The smart ones learned to embrace the monotony, to find comfort in the predictable rhythm of patrol routes and equipment checks. Mitchell had thought he was one of the smart ones. His radio crackled to life, cutting through the desert silence. "Delta Patrol, this is Gate Control. How's it looking out there, Mitchell?" "Same as always, Rodriguez. Quiet as a tomb." Mitchell adjusted his headset as he approached the motion sensor array, near the underground entrance. The sensors were military grade, designed to detect movement from mice to missiles, and they'd never given him trouble before. "You getting anything interesting on the cameras tonight?" "Just some coyotes about an hour ago. They scattered when the perimeter lights kicked on. Poor bastards probably thought they'd found easy pickings until the strobe started flashing." Sergeant Alex Rodriguez had been stationed here 3 years longer than Mitchell, and his voice carried the same weary resignation that seemed to infect everyone who spent too much time in the desert. "Sometimes I wonder if we're guarding this place from intruders, or if we're the ones being kept inside." It was the kind of philosophical observation that came with too many night shifts and too much coffee. Mitchell was about to respond with something equally meaningless when his motion detector started chirping erratically. The device, usually reliable to a fault, was flashing between green and red like it couldn't make up its mind. He stopped walking and examined the small screen, frowning at the conflicting readings. The display showed movement signatures that made no sense, patterns that suggested something large, moving in multiple directions simultaneously. According to the readout, there was both nothing there and everything there, a contradiction that shouldn't have been possible with properly functioning equipment. "Rodriguez, you seeing any activity on your end? My detector's acting up." Static answered him, harsh and full of interference he'd never heard before. Mitchell adjusted his radio, checking the battery indicator. Full power, strong signal strength, but nothing but white noise came through the speaker. "Rodriguez, do you copy?" Still nothing. The static seemed to pulse with a rhythm that was almost organic, like breathing or a heartbeat. Mitchell had heard equipment interference before, but this was different. This sounded almost alive. The motion detector fell silent, its screen going completely dark. Before flickering back to life, the timestamp was wrong now, showing random numbers that meant nothing. The date displayed as sometime in the year 2157, then switched to 1823, then settled on a series of symbols that weren't even numbers. Mitchell gave it a sharp tap, but the display remained scrambled. The device was military hardware, built to withstand electromagnetic pulses and direct impacts. It shouldn't have been malfunctioning like this unless something was actively interfering with its systems. That's when he noticed the scorch marks. They were burned into the concrete near the underground facility entrance, spiral patterns that definitely hadn't been there during his patrol the night before. The marks looked fresh, the concrete around them still warm to the touch when he knelt down to examine them. They weren't random scorch marks from electrical equipment or vehicle exhaust. These patterns were deliberate, complex, following mathematical progressions that hurt to look at for too long. Mitchell had seen burn patterns before, during his time with the National Guard. House fires, vehicle explosions, electrical accidents. This was none of those things. The spirals seemed to draw his eye inward, creating an optical illusion that made him dizzy if he stared too long. And underneath the patterns, barely visible in the concrete, were what looked like symbols or letters in no alphabet he recognized. The emergency lighting in Delta Zone began to strobe, casting wild shadows across the desert floor. Mitchell had seen equipment malfunctions before, but nothing like this. The lights pulsed in rhythm, almost like a heartbeat, and with each flash he could swear he heard something in his radio headset. Not static this time, but whispers just below the threshold of understanding. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to communicate but couldn't quite form the words. Mitchell caught fragments that might have been English, mixed with sounds that belonged to no human language. The voices seemed to come from multiple sources, overlapping and interweaving in patterns that made his head ache. He stood up, hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. Protocol said equipment malfunctions required investigation, especially near the underground facilities. Mitchell had never been inside the lower levels, but he had been briefed on the emergency procedures during his first week of assignment. Whatever they kept down there was important enough to warrant blast doors that could withstand nuclear explosions and electromagnetic locks that required presidential authorization to override. Important enough to kill for if the rumors were true. The stories varied depending on who was telling them and how much they'd had to drink, but they all shared common elements. Crashed aircraft with no terrestrial origin. Beings that weren't quite dead, but weren't quite alive either. Experiments that pushed the boundaries of science into realms that science wasn't meant to explore. Most of the old-timers dismissed the stories as nonsense, but they told them anyway. Usually late at night when the desert felt too big and too empty. Mitchell had always assumed the stories were just ways to cope with the boredom and isolation. Now, standing in the strobing emergency lights with those spiral patterns burned into the concrete at his feet, he wasn't so sure. As he approached the entrance, Mitchell's blood ran cold. The massive steel blast door, designed to withstand direct missile strikes and electromagnetic pulses, was standing open. Not wide open, but enough that he could see the dim, red glow of emergency lighting from within. That door was never supposed to be open. Ever. According to his briefing, the blast door was controlled by a system so secure that it required multiple authorization codes and biometric verification from at least 3 different personnel. The door had been installed by a company that specialized in nuclear bunker construction, with locks that were supposed to be impossible to bypass without proper authorization. The fact that it was open meant either someone with the highest possible clearance had authorized access, or something had gone catastrophically wrong with the security systems. Mitchell keyed his radio one more time, hoping the interference had cleared. "Gate control, this is Delta Patrol. I have a code yellow at underground access point 7. Blast door is unsealed, requesting immediate backup and supervisor notification." The whispers in his headset grew louder, almost forming words now. He could make out fragments that sounded like home and signal and something that might have been waiting. The voices carried an urgency that made his skin crawl, as if whatever was speaking was running out of time. He ripped the headset off and let it dangle from his shoulder, the voices still audible but muffled. The whispers seemed to be coming from multiple sources now, not just his radio but from the air itself, as if the very atmosphere around the facility had become a conductor for whatever was trying to communicate. Following protocol meant waiting for backup that might never come if his radio wasn't working. Following his gut meant people could be dying while he stood around in the desert waiting for help that couldn't hear his calls. Mitchell had joined the military to protect people, and that duty didn't disappear just because the situation fell outside normal parameters. He drew his sidearm and approached the entrance using his flashlight to peer into the corridor beyond. The hallway stretched into darkness, lined with doors marked with designation numbers and warning signs in multiple languages. Emergency power kept a few lights functioning, but most of the corridor was bathed in that ominous red glow that made everything look like a scene from hell. The air that drifted out smelled wrong, like ozone and something metallic that reminded him of blood. There was another scent underneath those, something organic and unfamiliar that made his nose burn when he breathed too deeply. Mitchell stepped inside, immediately noting how the temperature dropped by at least 10 degrees. The facility's climate control systems were designed to maintain precise environmental conditions for whatever research they conducted down here. The sudden cold suggested those systems were either malfunctioning or working harder than usual to compensate for some kind of heat source. The security office was his first stop, a small room just inside the entrance where the duty officer should have been monitoring the lower levels. The door was open, revealing banks of monitors that should have been showing feeds from throughout the facility. Instead, most displayed nothing but static, while others cycled through random images that made no sense. Some monitors showed corridors he didn't recognize, rooms that seemed too large to fit within the facility's known dimensions. Others displayed what looked like star fields or abstract patterns that hurt to look at directly. One screen showed what appeared to be the same corridor he was standing in, but from an angle that should have been impossible, given the camera placement he'd been shown during his briefing. The duty officer's chair was empty, but still warm when Mitchell touched the back of it. A cup of coffee sat on the desk, still steaming, suggesting whoever had been here had left recently and in a hurry. The coffee was black, no cream or sugar, and when Mitchell took a cautious sip, it tasted normal. Nothing was wrong with it, which somehow made its presence more unsettling than if it had been contaminated or spoiled. The logbook lay open on the desk, and Mitchell flipped to the most recent entries. The handwriting was neat and professional until the final entry at 10:15 p.m. Unusual electromagnetic readings from Research Wing B. Dr. Foster has requested additional power routing to Laboratory 5. Note: containment systems showing minor fluctuations. Will monitor and report any changes. The signature belonged to Security Chief Thomas Harper, a man Mitchell had met exactly once during his orientation. Harper had seemed competent and unflappable, a career military man who'd transitioned to civilian contractor work after 20 years in the army. He wasn't the type to abandon his post without good reason, and he definitely wasn't the type to leave his coffee behind if he was planning to return. Mitchell tried the desk phone, then the emergency communication system. Nothing worked. Every line was either dead or producing the same rhythmic static he'd heard on his radio. Even the internal facility communication system, which was supposed to be hardened against electromagnetic interference, was completely non-functional. The computer terminal was still active, showing a login screen that asked for credentials Mitchell didn't have, but the screensaver was cycling through security camera feeds, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Corridors filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source. Laboratories with equipment that appeared to be operating itself. And in one brief glimpse before the feed switched to another camera, what looked like a human figure standing motionless in a doorway but with proportions that weren't quite right. The corridor beyond the security office stretched deeper into the facility, branching off into different wings and research areas. Mitchell had memorized the basic layout during his briefing, But the emergency lighting made everything look different. Shadows fell at wrong angles, making distances hard to judge and creating optical illusions that made him question whether he was seeing corridors or something else entirely. Research Wing B was 2 levels down and accessible through the main elevator or the emergency stairwell. The elevator responded to his call, its doors opening with a cheerful ding that seemed obscenely normal, given the circumstances. But when he looked inside, the car was motionless between floors, its control panel dark except for a single red light that pulsed in the same rhythm as the emergency lighting. Mitchell pressed the call button again, but nothing happened. The elevator car remained frozen in place, and when he leaned into the shaft to look up or down, he saw only darkness. The emergency lighting should have illuminated at least part of the shaft, but it was as if the light was being absorbed by something before it could travel more than a few feet in either direction. The stairwell, it was. The door to the emergency stairs was heavier than it looked, requiring significant force to open despite the hydraulic assist system. Once inside, Mitchell found himself in a concrete shaft that echoed with every footstep. The sound seemed to travel much farther than it should have, bouncing off walls and creating multiple echoes that made it impossible to tell if someone else was moving around in the stairwell. His flashlight beam revealed stairs that descended into darkness, with emergency lighting fixtures that were either dead or functioning so dimly they provided no useful illumination. The concrete walls were bare except for level markings and the occasional safety poster, but as Mitchell descended, he began to notice something else. The same spiral patterns he'd seen burned into the concrete outside were etched into the walls here, but these were much smaller and more subtle. They looked like they'd been carved rather than burned, created with precision tools by someone with significant artistic skill. The patterns formed continuous chains that spiraled down the stairwell, following mathematical progressions that made his eyes water when he tried to trace them. Mitchell counted the levels as he descended, but the numbers on the doors didn't match what he'd been told during his briefing. According to his orientation, Research Wing B was on sub-level 2, but the door marked sub-level 2 inches led to what looked like a storage area, while the door marked Research Wing B was on what should have been sub-level 4. Either his briefing had been wrong, or the facility was larger and more complex than he'd been led to believe. When he reached the door marked Research Wing B, he found it standing wide open, just like the main entrance. The laboratory beyond was a disaster zone that looked like a war had been fought inside it. Tables were overturned, computer equipment lay shattered on the floor, and broken glass crunched under Mitchell's boots as he moved through the wreckage. But this wasn't random destruction. The damage followed patterns, as if whatever had caused it was methodical and intelligent. Computer terminals had been opened, and their components removed with surgical precision. Laboratory equipment had been disassembled and its parts arranged in geometric patterns on the floor. Even the broken glass had been swept into spiral formations that matched the patterns he'd seen elsewhere. Emergency lighting cast everything in that hellish red glow, making the destruction look like a scene from a war zone. But as Mitchell moved through the laboratory, he began to realize that the red light wasn't coming entirely from the emergency fixtures. Some of it was emanating from the walls themselves, from patterns that had been etched or burned into the concrete and now glowed with their own inner fire. In the center of the lab stood what appeared to be some kind of containment unit, a cylindrical chamber made of reinforced steel and lined with electronic monitoring equipment. The chamber was easily 8 feet tall and 4 feet in diameter, built like a bank vault with multiple locking mechanisms and warning labels in several languages. The chamber door hung open, its interior bathed in shadows that his flashlight couldn't seem to penetrate. Whatever had been inside was gone, but the interior of the chamber bore the same spiral patterns that seemed to be spreading throughout the facility. These patterns glowed more brightly than the others, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Mitchell approached the containment unit cautiously, noting that the electronic monitoring equipment was still functional, despite the apparent chaos. Banks of computers continued to hum quietly, their screens displaying data streams that consisted entirely of numbers and symbols he didn't recognize. The data was flowing too quickly to read, but it seemed to be tracking something in real time. The walls around the containment unit bore the same spiral burn marks he'd found outside, but these were larger and more complex, forming patterns that seemed to shift and move when he wasn't looking directly at them. The marks pulsed with a faint luminescence that grew brighter as he approached, as if responding to his presence. He reached out to touch one of the patterns, then thought better of it. The air around the marks felt charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. His skin tingled when he got too close, and he could taste metal in the back of his throat. "Hello? Is anyone down here?" Mitchell's voice echoed through the empty laboratory, but no response came. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the glowing patterns on the walls, muffled and distorted until it bore no resemblance to his own voice. When the echoes finally faded, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if something was actively suppressing sound. He was about to call out again when he heard something from deeper in the facility. Not a voice, but a sound like metal groaning under stress. It was rhythmic, almost musical, as if someone was playing a percussion instrument made of steel beams and concrete. Mitchell followed the sound through a connecting corridor, past more laboratories and storage rooms that showed signs of the same methodical destruction he'd seen in the main lab. Doors had been removed from their hinges and stacked in neat piles. Ceiling tiles had been arranged in complex geometric patterns on the floor. Even the emergency lighting fixtures had been repositioned to create shadow patterns that formed the same spirals he was seeing everywhere else. The sound grew louder as he progressed deeper into the facility, leading him to a section that wasn't on any map he'd been shown. The corridors here were wider and taller, built on a scale that seemed designed for something larger than human beings. The ceiling was at least 12 feet high, supported by massive concrete pillars that were themselves decorated with carved spiral patterns. Finally, he reached what appeared to be a supply closet with its door slightly ajar. Light filtered out from within, but it wasn't the red glow of emergency lighting. This light was white and cold, with a quality that reminded him of moonlight on snow. He could hear someone breathing heavily inside, along with what sounded like quiet sobbing. "Hello? This is base security. Are you injured?" A woman's voice, shaky with terror. "Don't come in here, please, just go away. It's not safe, nothing's safe anymore." Mitchell holstered his weapon and gently pushed the door open. Inside, crouched behind boxes of equipment, was Dr. Amanda Foster. He recognized her from the personnel files he'd studied during his orientation, a 30-something physicist who'd been working at the facility for over 5 years. Her usually neat appearance was disheveled, her lab coat torn and stained with what looked like burns from electrical discharge. "Dr. Foster, I'm Private Mitchell from Surface Security. What happened down here?" She looked up at him with wild eyes, as if she couldn't quite believe he was real. Her pupils were dilated despite the bright light in the closet, and her hands shook when she tried to push her hair out of her face. "You shouldn't be here. None of us should be here. We never should have started the experiments." Mitchell knelt down beside her, speaking in the calm tone he'd learned during combat training. "I need you to tell me what happened. Where is everyone else? Where's Security Chief Harper?" Dr. Foster took a shuddering breath, trying to compose herself. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she was afraid something might hear her. "It was Container 9. We thought it was dormant, had been for 30 years. The crash site in Nevada, 1991. We'd been studying it ever since, but it never showed any signs of activity. We ran every test we could think of, subjected it to every form of analysis available. Nothing. It just sat there like a piece of dead rock. What was in the container? We don't know. We never knew. We called it Subject 9, but it wasn't like anything in our databases. Not biological, not mechanical, something else entirely. Dr. Walsh thought it might be some kind of energy-based life form, but we could never prove it. It didn't respond to stimuli, didn't emit any kind of radiation, didn't show any signs of life or intelligence. Mitchell helped her to her feet, noting how she trembled as she spoke. Her lab coat was singed in several places, and there were small burns on her hands and arms that looked like electrical injuries. What changed? Why did it wake up now? The electromagnetic experiments. Dr. Walsh had a theory that it might be dormant rather than dead, that we just needed to find the right frequency to wake it up. We'd been trying to stimulate it with controlled EM pulses for weeks, hoping to provoke some kind of response. Different frequencies, different intensities, different patterns. For weeks, nothing happened. We were about to abandon the project and reclassify it as inert material. Dr. Foster paused, staring at something only she could see. Then, tonight, during the 10 o'clock test cycle, it just came alive. Not gradually, not slowly. 1 second, it was a dead lump of whatever it was made of. And the next second, it was moving, thinking, learning. It absorbed the electromagnetic pulse we hit it with and used that energy to break containment. Where are the others? Dr. Walsh, the technician, Security Chief Harper? Dr. Foster's face went pale, and she started trembling harder. Harper tried to contain it when the alarm started. Standard protocol for containment breach. He sealed the laboratory and called for backup, then went in with riot gear and non-lethal weapons. We could hear everything over the intercom. Shouting, then gunfire, lots of gunfire. Harper was shooting at something, but it wasn't shooting back. Then, everything went quiet. She wiped tears from her eyes, leaving streaks in the grime on her face. Walsh was in Laboratory 5 when it happened, running spectral analysis on tissue samples. Rachel Kim was monitoring from the control room, coordinating between the different research teams. When the containment alarm went off, they both tried to implement lockdown procedures. Are they alive? I don't know, the thing, Subject 9, it doesn't just kill, it studies, it learns. When it broke containment, it didn't try to escape the laboratory. It didn't attack anyone directly. It started interfacing with our computer systems, our electronics. It was accessing our databases, downloading our research, learning everything we knew about it and everything we knew about ourselves. Mitchell's radio crackled back to life, but instead of Rodriguez's voice, he heard something else entirely. A sound like static, but with rhythm and pattern, almost like speech in a language that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his brain. The sound was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like music played on instruments that shouldn't exist. It's trying to communicate, Dr. Foster whispered, but not with us, with something else, something far away. We need to get you out of here, Mitchell said, but Dr. Foster shook her head. The elevators aren't working. The stairwells may be compromised. It's been changing the facility, rerouting power, sealing doors. I've been hiding here for hours, listening to it work. It's not just in the electronics anymore. It's changing the physical structure of the building, rearranging things to suit its purposes. As if responding to her words, the lights in the corridor outside flickered and died, leaving them in total darkness save for Mitchell's flashlight. In the distance, they could hear the groaning of metal and the hum of electrical systems coming back online in new configurations. There's something else, Dr. Foster said, her voice barely a whisper. I don't think it wants to escape Area 51. I've been monitoring the power grid from my laptop, and it's been drawing massive amounts of electricity from the facility's main reactor. Not to break free, but to power something big. What kind of something? I think it wants to use our communication arrays to send a signal, to call for others. Mitchell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. Others? More of its kind. This might not be the only one that crashed. If it succeeds in making contact, if it can tell its people where it is and what it's learned about us. The implication hung in the air between them. Mitchell checked his weapon, ensuring a full magazine was loaded. He had 2 spare magazines on his belt, 90 rounds total. It didn't seem like nearly enough. Is there any way to stop it? Maybe. There's an electromagnetic pulse device in the main laboratory, designed for equipment sterilization and data security. It's powerful enough to wipe every electronic system in the facility clean. If we could activate it, the pulse might disrupt the entity's energy matrix long enough to... well, I don't know what it would do to the entity, but it would definitely stop it from accessing our systems. What's the catch? The EMP would destroy every electronic system in the facility. No lights, no elevators, no communication, no life support. We'd be trapped down here until rescue teams could reach us, assuming anyone on the surface realizes what's happened. Mitchell weighed their options: stay hidden and hope the entity ignored them while it completed whatever it was planning, or risk everything to prevent it from potentially calling others of its kind to Earth. Neither choice seemed appealing, but he'd sworn an oath to protect his country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And whatever Subject 9 was, it definitely qualified as foreign. "Show me where the EMP device is," he said. They moved through the darkened corridors like ghosts, using Mitchell's flashlight sparingly to avoid attracting attention. The facility had taken on a different character since the entity's escape, with corridors that seemed longer than they should be, and doors that led to rooms that weren't on any map Mitchell had memorized. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with that faint inner light, and the spiral patterns carved into the concrete appeared to be growing, extending themselves with geometric precision. It was as if the entity was rewriting the facility's structure at a fundamental level, turning it into something that served its purposes rather than human ones. Dr. Foster led him through a maintenance passage he'd discovered years earlier during a routine inspection. The passage was narrow and uncomfortable, designed for equipment access rather than human travel, but it bypassed the main corridors and led directly to Laboratory 5. As they crawled through the confined space, Mitchell could hear sounds echoing through the ventilation system above them. Not mechanical sounds, but something organic and rhythmic, like breathing or singing. The sounds were beautiful in an alien way, harmonics and frequencies that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "It's everywhere now," Dr. Foster whispered as they crawled. "In the walls, in the electrical systems, in the very structure of the building. It's not just using the facility anymore. It's becoming part of it." The maintenance passage ended at an access panel that opened into Laboratory 5. As they emerged, Mitchell saw Dr. Kevin Walsh's ID badge melted into the wall, like it was made of plastic instead of laminated cardboard. The metal doorframe around it was warped and discolored, as if subjected to intense heat that had somehow left the surrounding concrete untouched. "Walsh was here when it happened," Dr. Foster said, running her fingers along the damaged wall. "This is all that's left of him. The entity didn't kill him in any conventional sense. It absorbed him, took everything he was, and made it part of itself." Mitchell found evidence of Security Chief Harper's last stand in the main corridor leading to the laboratory complex. Bullet holes pocked the walls in tight groupings, the kind of shooting pattern that came from training and experience under pressure. Shell casings littered the floor, brass gleaming in the light from Mitchell's flashlight. But there was no body, no blood, nothing to indicate what had happened to Harper after he emptied his weapon. The bullet holes themselves were strange. They were perfectly round and showed no signs of impact deformation, as if whatever Harper had been shooting at had somehow absorbed the kinetic energy of the bullets without being physically affected by them. Some of the holes glowed with the same faint light as the spiral patterns, suggesting the entity had somehow transformed the metal of the bullets into part of its growing network. The backup generator chose that moment to kick in, flooding the corridor with harsh, fluorescent light. The sudden illumination revealed the true extent of what the entity had been doing during the hours since its escape. The walls and ceiling were now covered with an intricate network of spiral patterns that pulsed and flowed like living things. The patterns were beautiful and terrible at the same time, following mathematical progressions that spoke to something deep in the human brain. They drew the eye inward, creating optical illusions that made Mitchell feel like he was falling, even though his feet remained firmly on the ground. The longer he looked at them, the more he could swear he heard music, harmonics that resonated in his bones and made his teeth ache. "Don't stare at them too long," Dr. Foster warned. "Rachel Kim spent 20 minutes studying the patterns in the control room before I found her. When I did, she was different." "Different how?" "You'll see." They made their way deeper into the laboratory complex, passing rooms that had been transformed beyond recognition. Equipment had been rearranged into complex geometric configurations that served no apparent scientific purpose. Computer terminals displayed streams of data in symbols and languages that didn't belong to Earth. And everywhere, those spirals continued to grow and spread, turning the facility into something that resembled a work of art more than a military installation. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" The voice came from behind them, and Mitchell spun around to see technician Rachel Kim standing at the far end of the corridor. She looked normal except for her eyes, which reflected the fluorescent light like mirrors, and her skin, which had taken on a faint luminescence that matched the patterns on the walls. "Rachel," Dr. Foster called out, "thank God you're alive. We need to get out of here." Kim walked toward them with measured steps, her movements fluid and graceful, in a way that seemed completely unnatural for a human being. As she got closer, Mitchell could see that the spiral patterns had been carved into her skin, glowing softly with the same inner light he'd seen elsewhere in the facility. "There's no need to leave, Amanda. Subject 9 has shown me such wonderful things. The secrets of the universe, the truth about what lies beyond the stars. Did you know that space isn't empty? It's full of voices singing songs that have been playing since the birth of the universe." Mitchell drew his weapon, but Kim made no threatening moves. Instead, she tilted her head like she was listening to something only she could hear, and smiled with an expression of perfect contentment. "It doesn't want to hurt us," she continued, her voice carrying harmonics that shouldn't have been possible with human vocal cords. "It just wants to go home. But first it needs to let its people know where it is. The communication arrays upstairs are perfect for that purpose. With enough power, the signal can reach across the galaxy in a matter of hours." "Rachel, listen to me," Dr. Foster pleaded. "That thing is using you. It's not your friend. It's a parasite that's taken over your mind and body." Kim's mirror-bright eyes focused on Dr. Foster with an intensity that made Mitchell's skin crawl. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from multiple sources at once, as if several people were speaking in perfect unison. "You still don't understand, do you? It's not using me. We're partners now. I can see what it sees, know what it knows. The crash in 1991 wasn't an accident, Amanda. It was a scout sent to study this world and determine if it was suitable for colonization." The facility's intercom system crackled to life, filling the corridor with that same rhythmic static Mitchell had heard earlier. But now he could make out patterns in the noise, mathematical progressions that spoke directly to some primitive part of his brain. The sound was hypnotic and beautiful, like music played on instruments made of starlight and vacuum. "Greetings, Private Mitchell." The voice came from every speaker in the facility simultaneously, a sound like wind through dead leaves mixed with the hum of electrical current. It spoke English, but with an accent that belonged to no earthly nation. The words seemed to bypass his ears entirely, appearing directly in his mind as fully formed thoughts. You have been most persistent in your investigation, most admirable. Your species shows such promise when properly motivated. Mitchell kept his weapon trained on Kim, who continued to stare at them with those unnatural eyes. What do you want? What any traveller wants when far from home. To send word to my people that I have survived, that this world holds promise for our kind. Your communication arrays will serve this purpose admirably once I have made the necessary modifications to boost their range and power. And then what? You invade? Something that might have been laughter echoed through the speakers, a sound like crystal chimes being played in a windstorm. Invade? Such a crude concept. We prefer to think of it as integration. Your species has such potential, but you waste it on petty conflicts and small thinking. We can help you transcend those limitations, show you wonders beyond your current comprehension. Dr. Foster grabbed Mitchell's arm, her grip tight enough to leave bruises. The EMP device is in the next laboratory. If we can reach it. Dr. Foster speaks of the electromagnetic pulse generator, the entity said, having apparently heard every word despite their whispered conversation. An interesting solution, but ultimately futile. I've already begun the transmission sequence, drawing power from your facility's reactor and redirecting it through modified communication arrays. In 17 minutes, my signal will reach the deep space relay station your government believes is secret and be broadcast across the galaxy. My people will know that Earth is ready for the next phase of evolution. Kim began walking toward them again, her movements now completely fluid and inhuman. She seemed to glide rather than walk, her feet barely touching the ground. As she approached, Mitchell could see that the spiral patterns in her skin were moving, flowing like liquid light beneath the surface. Don't fight this, Amanda. Ryan, let it show you what we could become. The entity doesn't want to destroy humanity. It wants to improve us, to help us reach our full potential. The pain of transformation is temporary, but the benefits are eternal. Mitchell made his decision. He grabbed Dr. Foster's hand and ran towards Laboratory 6, where she'd said the EMP device was located. Behind them, Kim's laughter echoed through the corridor, but she made no attempt to follow. Instead, she simply stood there, watching them go with those mirror-bright eyes and that unsettling smile. The corridor seemed to stretch longer than it should have as they ran, and Mitchell began to suspect the entity was manipulating their perception of space and distance. Doors that should have led to specific laboratories opened onto rooms that bore no resemblance to the facility's original design. The walls pulsed with increasing brightness, and the spiral patterns seemed to reach out toward them as they passed. Finally, they reached Laboratory 6, which was in worse condition than the others. Equipment had been scattered across the floor and walls, but not randomly. Every piece had been arranged according to some vast geometric pattern that covered the entire room. Computers, laboratory instruments, furniture, even pieces of broken glass had been positioned with mathematical precision to create a design that hurt to look at directly. But in the center of the room, intact and apparently functional, stood the EMP generator. It looked like a large metal cylinder surrounded by control panels and warning signs in multiple languages. The device was clearly military grade, built to deliver electromagnetic pulses powerful enough to disable entire city blocks worth of electronic equipment. "How do we activate it?" Mitchell asked, keeping his weapon ready, while Dr. Foster examined the control systems. Dr. Foster was already working at the control panel, her fingers flying over switches and dials with the confidence of someone who'd operated the device before. "It needs to charge for about 2 minutes, then we manually trigger the pulse. But Ryan, when this thing goes off, it's going to kill every electronic system in the facility. No lights, no elevators, no communication, no life support. We'll be trapped down here until someone comes looking for us." "How long before rescue?" "Unknown, Could be hours, could be days. The facility is designed to be self-contained for extended periods. If the surface personnel think we're just conducting routine classified experiments, they might not investigate for quite a while. And we don't know if the EMP will actually stop the entity or just make it angry. The generator began to emit a high-pitched whine as it charged, and the lights in the laboratory flickered ominously. Mitchell could hear sounds in the walls now, like something large moving through spaces that should have been too small to accommodate it. The spiral patterns on the walls began to pulse faster, their glow increasing in intensity as if the entity was becoming agitated. 15 minutes until transmission completion, the entity's voice announced through the speakers, its tone carrying a note of satisfaction that made Mitchell's skin crawl. "I am disappointed in your choice, Dr. Foster. I had hoped you would see reason. The transformation process is far less painful when voluntary." The laboratory door slammed shut with a metallic clang that echoed through the room like a gunshot. Mitchell tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The entity had sealed them in with their only weapon against it, and Mitchell could hear the locks engaging with the finality of a tomb being sealed. "The charging process is automated now," Dr. Foster said, stepping back from the control panel. 90 seconds until we can fire, but we need to be careful about the timing. If we activate it too early, it might not have enough power to affect the entity. Too late, and it completes its transmission. The temperature in the room began to rise, and Mitchell could see the metal walls starting to glow with heat. The entity was trying to cook them alive before they could activate the EMP, turning the laboratory into an oven. Sweat began to pour down his face, and his uniform quickly became soaked with perspiration. "Can we speed up the process? Not without risking the device overloading. If it fails, we won't get another chance. The entity will complete its transmission, and then..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Mitchell could fill in the blanks. 60 seconds. The walls were hot enough now that touching them would cause severe burns. Mitchell's vision began to blur from the heat, and he could feel his skin starting to blister where it was exposed. Dr. Foster was starting to show signs of heat exhaustion, her face flushed and her breathing laboured. Through the speakers, the entity's voice continued its countdown. 10 minutes until transmission complete. Your resistance is admirable, but futile. My people have been waiting centuries for word from this sector. They will be pleased to learn of humanity's potential." The heat continued to increase, and Mitchell realized they might not survive long enough to activate the EMP. The entity was being methodical about it, raising the temperature gradually to prolong their suffering. It wanted them to understand the futility of resistance, to break their will before they died. 30 seconds. The air itself felt like it was burning Mitchell's lungs with each breath. Dr. Foster collapsed to her knees, overcome by the heat, and Mitchell had to support her weight to keep her conscious. The control panel for the EMP generator was almost too hot to touch, but they had no choice. "Now!" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of metal expanding and contracting under the extreme heat. "Activate it now." Mitchell slammed his hand down on the firing control, ignoring the pain as the superheated metal burned his palm. The world exploded into white light as the EMP pulse detonated with the force of a controlled nuclear explosion. The electromagnetic wave hit like a physical blow, a wall of energy that made every nerve in Mitchell's body fire at once. He felt like he was being electrocuted and struck by lightning simultaneously, his vision filling with stars and his hearing replaced by a roaring sound that seemed to come from inside his own skull. The lights died instantly, plunging them into absolute darkness that was somehow deeper than the absence of light. The oppressive heat vanished as if it had never existed, leaving them gasping in air that suddenly felt arctic by comparison. Every electronic system in the facility went silent at once, creating a void of sound that was more unsettling than any noise. In the silence that followed, Mitchell could hear nothing but his own heartbeat and Dr. Foster's laboured breathing. No humming of electrical systems, no whispers from the radio, no voice speaking through the intercom. The facility had gone completely dead, as if someone had simply switched off the entire world. "Did it work?" Mitchell whispered, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the absolute silence. "I don't know," Dr. Foster replied, her own voice weak and shaky. "The entity was using the electrical systems to maintain its coherence in our reality. Without power, it might have been disrupted, sent back to wherever it came from. Or it might have found another way to exist, something we didn't account for." They sat in the darkness for what felt like hours, listening for any sign that the entity had survived the pulse. But the silence was complete, broken only by the distant sound of structural settling as the facility's systems went offline and the building began to cool. Mitchell tried his flashlight, but it was dead, its electronics fried by the EMP. He felt around in the darkness until he found Dr. Foster, who was sitting with her back against the wall, still breathing heavily from their ordeal. "What happens now?" he asked. "We wait. The surface personnel will notice when the facility goes dark. Standard protocol is to wait 4 hours for an all-clear signal before sending in a rescue team. If we're lucky, they'll be here by dawn. And if we're unlucky, then we find out if the entity is really gone, or if it's just waiting for us to make a mistake." The hours that followed were the longest of Mitchell's life. They sat in complete darkness, too afraid to move around the laboratory for fear of injuring themselves on the equipment that had been scattered by the entity's rampage. Every sound, every creak of settling metal or whisper of air through the ventilation system made them freeze and listen intently for signs of movement. Dr. Foster told him about the years of research that had led to this moment, the hundreds of tests and experiments they'd conducted on Subject 9, without ever suspecting what it truly was. She spoke of colleagues who devoted their careers to understanding the entity, only to have their work turned against them when it finally awakened. Mitchell told her about his time in the National Guard, about the IED that had nearly killed him in Afghanistan and convinced him to seek out a quieter assignment. He'd thought guarding a desert research facility would be the most boring job in the military. He'd never been more wrong about anything in his life. Eventually, Mitchell heard something that wasn't the sound of settling metal or moving air. A rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from far above them, echoing down through the concrete and steel like the heartbeat of some massive creature. "Drilling," Dr. Foster said, relief evident in her voice even though Mitchell couldn't see her face in the darkness. "Someone's drilling through the main entrance. The blast door must have sealed automatically when the power went out." It took another 6 hours for the rescue team to reach them. 6 hours of listening to the steady rhythm of drilling equipment working its way through reinforced steel and concrete. 6 hours of wondering if the entity was truly gone or simply waiting for the power to be restored. 6 hours of sitting in absolute darkness, afraid to hope that their ordeal was finally over. When the flashlight beams finally cut through the blackness and voices called their names, Mitchell had never been happier to see another human being. The rescue team consisted of military personnel in full hazmat gear, moving with the cautious efficiency of people who'd been briefed on potential biological or chemical hazards. "2 survivors in Laboratory 6, one of them called into his radio, both conscious and responsive, no obvious injuries, but they'll need medical evaluation." As they were helped to their feet and escorted toward the surface, Mitchell got his first look at what the EMP had done to the facility. The walls were scarred and blackened, but the spiral patterns were gone, leaving only faint impressions in the concrete like shadows burned by atomic fire. The equipment that had been so precisely arranged was now just scattered debris, and the sense of alien presence that had permeated the facility was completely absent. The debriefing took place in a sterile conference room at another facility 300 miles from Groom Lake. Men in expensive suits asked questions. Mitchell wasn't allowed to answer truthfully, their faces expressionless as they took notes on laptops that recorded everything he said. He signed forms that made him forget things he'd never officially seen, and agreed to transfer to a different assignment far from Nevada. The official story was a catastrophic electrical failure that had damaged the facility's power grid and forced an emergency evacuation. Equipment malfunction, nothing more. The kind of industrial accident that happened occasionally in high-tech facilities, regrettable but not unprecedented. But as they led him to the transport that would take him away from Groom Lake forever, Mitchell looked back at the facility entrance one last time. The concrete around the blast door still bore faint traces of those spiral burn marks, barely visible in the desert sunlight, but unmistakably there. And sometimes when the wind blew just right across the desert, he could swear he heard whispers in the static of his new radio. The nightmares started a week later. Dreams of spirals that moved and shifted, of voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Dreams of Kim's mirror-bright eyes and her promise that the transformation was only temporarily painful. Dreams of vast spaces between the stars where things that weren't quite alive and weren't quite dead sang songs that had been playing since the birth of the universe. Mitchell's new assignment was at a base in Georgia, about as far from Nevada as the military could manage without sending him overseas. It was routine work, the kind of deployment he'd originally hoped for when he requested active duty, but he found himself volunteering for extra night shifts, afraid to sleep and dream of things that shouldn't exist. His commanding officer eventually noticed the exhaustion and ordered him to see the base psychiatrist, a kind woman who diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder and prescribed medication that helped him sleep without dreaming. She didn't ask what had caused the PTSD, and Mitchell was grateful for her discretion. The medication helped, but it couldn't erase the memory of what he'd seen in the depths of Area 51. Sometimes, late at night when he was alone on guard duty, Mitchell would find himself staring at the patterns of stars visible in the Georgia sky. He'd wonder if somewhere out there, beings like Subject 9 were receiving signals from deep space, learning that Earth had been scouted and found suitable for their purposes. 3 weeks after his transfer, Private Jake Thompson began his first patrol shift in Delta Zone at Groom Lake, walking the same route Mitchell had once walked. The briefing officer assured him it was routine duty, guarding experimental aircraft and weather monitoring equipment. The facility had been completely rebuilt after the electrical fire, with new equipment and enhanced security measures. Nothing interesting ever happened at Area 51, they told him. Nothing at all. Thompson nodded and accepted his assignment with the enthusiasm of a young soldier eager to serve his country. He'd requested the posting after hearing rumours about the important work being done at Groom Lake, and he was excited to be part of something significant, even if he wasn't allowed to know what that something was. On his first night of patrol, Thompson noticed some unusual markings in the concrete near the underground entrance. They looked like burn marks, but they formed patterns that were too regular and complex to be accidental. When he asked his supervisor about them, he was told they were just cosmetic damage from the electrical fire. Nothing to worry about. But sometimes, when Thompson walked his patrol route in the early hours of the morning, he could swear he heard whispers in his radio static. Voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize, calling from somewhere very far away. The voices were faint and barely audible, but they seemed to be getting stronger each night, as if something was slowly awakening in the depths below. Thompson dismissed the voices as interference from the facility's communication equipment, just as his supervisors had told him to. But deep underground, in laboratories that had been rebuilt and restocked with new equipment, spiral patterns were beginning to appear again in the concrete walls. Faint at first, barely visible in the fluorescent lighting, but growing stronger and more complex with each passing day. The entity had learned patience during its long captivity, and it had learned from its mistakes. This time, it would be more careful, more subtle in its approach. It would wait for the right moment, the right opportunity, the right configuration of circumstances that would allow it to complete its interrupted mission. Somewhere in the desert night, carried on radio waves that travelled at the speed of light toward distant stars, a signal continued to broadcast. A message in a language older than human civilization, telling anyone who cared to listen that Earth was ready for the next phase of contact. And in the darkness between the stars, ancient beings that had been waiting for centuries finally began to stir, their sleep disturbed by dreams of a small blue planet where intelligent life had evolved to the point where it could serve their purposes. The signal would take years to reach its intended recipients, but it was already on its way, carrying coordinates and data about human civilization that would make the coming integration so much easier. Subject 9 had failed to escape its earthly prison, but it had succeeded in its primary mission. The scouts had made contact. The way was prepared. All that remained was to wait for the others to arrive.